on our fantastic new report, Women, Automation, and the Future of Work. I see some old friends of IWPR here, and I'm pleased, and I see a lot of Hill staff, and we're equally pleased about that. Before we start, I want to thank Representative Lois Frankel from the great state of Florida, 21st District, and her staff for hosting our briefing today. And I also want to give a shout out to the funder of IWPR's report, which is JPMorgan Chase, maybe incorporated at the end, I'm not sure. No, company, JPMorgan Chase and Company. And Jenny Sparandara, whom you'll hear from later, is the head of Workforce Initiatives, Global Philanthropy. And we thank you for your generous grant. And we also have Heather Higginbotham, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy, Corporate Responsibility for JPMorgan Chase and Company. And you may know Heather from her time in the Obama administration, where she worked at the State Department, OMB, and the Domestic Policy Council in the White House. Thank you, Heather, and now I can turn it over to you to give us a welcome on behalf of JPMorgan Chase. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Heidi. It's really wonderful to be here. And I had the same thought that you did. On this beautiful day, we've got everybody in this room because they care so much about this topic. So we're so grateful that you're here for this presentation and discussion. The Institute for Women's Policy Research has been a key partner of ours at JPMorgan Chase and our New Skills at Work initiative. 3 years ago, we came together for the release of an IWPR report entitled Pathways to Equity. And that's centered on improving women's access to good middle-skill jobs. And at that time, we were focused on bridging the gap between the good-paying jobs that were available and the millions of people who were struggling to find better employment opportunities. Now, 3 years later, the labor market is the tightest it's been in decades, and occupations and industries are transforming due to the changing technology and the nature of work. And it's this combination of factors that led to our second research partnership with IWPR, and this time, of course, focusing on the gender implications of the future of work. The work that we've been doing in partnership with IWPR and funding is important to us because we see a pressing need to expand access to opportunity and enable more people to share in the rewards of an inclusive and growing economy. And our mission is to help drive that inclusive growth and create an economy that works for more people. So as you're going to get to hear in a few minutes from this illustrious panel, the changing nature of our economy is going to have significant and different impacts for women and men. And it's essential that we understand these dynamics and collectively begin addressing them. And we often are talking nowadays about the future of work, but it's clear from this report that if we want to see an economy that reduces workforce inequalities, the time for us to take action is now. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the panel.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Morass. He covers economic and labor issues for the Wall Street Journal, and he's moderating our panel discussion today. I would say that he is, well, let's just say I first met him when his wife had just had twins, I think, and so he is recommended for that reason. So. You know, I think this is premature because we have to present our report first. So, but you know, he's a nice guy, and now you know Eric. So, am I supposed to talk about our report now? No, it's just very confusing because I expected to see my colleagues from IWPR up here on the panel, and they're not. So, it's definitely confusing. But so let me try the slideshow. Maybe that'll work better. Let's see, where are we? See if you can do it.
Let's see, page down. Oh, sorry, we should have tested this before.
If you haven't met Jennifer Clark, she's our Director of Communications. There's seats up front here. There's one seat in the front row. There's 2 seats up here.
No, well, yeah, just to advance. You go that way. Here, sorry. You do this way, and then that way. Okay?
Okay, great. Okay, there's a seat up front. There's actually 2 seats up front and 2 in the second row here for people who need seating. So in introducing our report, I want you to call your attention to some of these headlines on the next slide. And robots will destroy our jobs, and we're not ready for it. Automation will affect women twice as much as men. It's nice to see some gender titles coming from the news, but, you know, women should fear artificial intelligence more than men. I guess our brains are weaker, so we should fear it more, but I wouldn't fear it more. It will ultimately hurt men as well. All AI and robots will destroy fewer than jobs than previously feared, says one new report, and another, employees are optimistic about working with AI. And another, automation could wipe out almost half of all jobs in 20 years. So you won't be too surprised to hear that when I got my PhD in economics, there's a small ceremony that no one talks about, so I'll clue you into this secret. You get inoculated with a serum, and it says, technological change is good. And so once you've been inoculated with that serum, you tend to have a much more optimistic view of technological change. So I would like to say that although our report does not come to a specific number conclusion, and we have some things we definitely feel we should pay attention to, such as those that Heather talked about, on the whole, I am personally quite optimistic, and I actually support the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, conclusion that jobs will grow overall by 7% by 2026, which is their latest projection. But the main point that we would like you to look at, these key takeaways, are that women do outnumber men in the occupations with the highest likelihood of automation. They are 58% of the jobs that have a 90% chance of automation in the next few years, and they are only 47% of the labor force, so they are overrepresented in those jobs. Automation threatens both well-paid jobs for women and low-paid jobs for women, and it threatens low-paid jobs for more men than their high-paid jobs. So that's another reason why women are more at risk. The other thing our report does is break down these impacts on women and men of different race and ethnic groups. So this is the only report really doing that for future projections in the United States, and I think you'll find it very interesting. But part of the reason that women outnumber men in occupations with the highest likelihood of automation is that women and men are segregated in the labor market. And I'm sure we don't mostly think of it very often, but about half of women, almost half of women, 40% I believe, work in jobs that are dominated by women. That means there's 75% or more men. And half of women and half of men work in jobs that are dominated by men. So 2 examples that come to mind: secretaries, you won't be surprised, 94% female. Truck drivers, 94% male. So that's the way the labor market is. You will also see concentrations of women of color, men of color in different occupations from each other and from whites. And that's why we expect these different impacts for these different groups of women and men. We think that the fact that women do a disproportionate share of homework is very important, family care and homework. And we see the positive impact there of technology, but there's also the possibility of greater exploitation in that area as well, as many women of color work in caregiving jobs all throughout the economy. So we're here on the Hill. We want to say that, of course, public policy matters. We thank you for doing your jobs every day. The future is uncertain, but the policy that we do will make a great difference. Companies like JPMorgan, which are in the lead for training their workers internally, AT&T is another one, good reputation for that, are very important because they're seeing the future head on. So that's a good thing, and we should have the same response on Capitol Hill. So at this point, I believe I'm calling on my colleague, Chandra Childers. Chandra is a study director at IWPR, and she has a doctorate in sociology. Thank you, Chandra. Don't trip.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming out. We really appreciate you coming and letting us share our research with you, and we're really excited about our findings. And so I'm going to get a little bit more into them. And so here what I have here, the bars in the middle show women's share of the labor force. So as Heidi said, women make up 47% of all workers in the labor force, but they make up the majority of workers in both high-risk and low-risk occupations. So women make up 58% of those in jobs that have a high risk of automation. And we defined occupations as having a high risk of automation if there is a 90% or greater chance that workers in the occupation could be replaced with automation or other technology. So high-risk occupations include some low-wage jobs. So these are jobs like cashiers, cooks. They generally have low pay. They don't generally provide workers with benefits. And these are jobs that we might not worry about losing because they're not generally good jobs. But in high-risk jobs, there's also some really important jobs, like secretaries and administrative assistants and office clerks. These are occupations that provide women without a college degree a pathway to a middle-class income without having to have advanced education. Yet these occupations are at very high risk of automation or the technologies replacing the workers in them. So that's an area that's of major concern. But women are also the majority of workers in low-risk occupations. And these are occupations that there is a 10% chance or less that workers can be replaced in these occupations. But again, teachers, nurses, software developers, on average, these jobs tend to pay better. They're going to be more stable. We expect to see less turnover in them, but they generally do require a college education. So we're losing those that don't require advanced education but provide good earnings, and the ones that are stable will require more educations going forward. We also find women overrepresented in the set of occupations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects to add the most jobs through 2026. And so these are occupations like personal care aides, nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides, registered nurses. So these are occupations that personal care aides, for example, is projected to add the most new jobs at 777,000. Nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides will add over 600,000, or projected to add over 600,000 new jobs. So these are occupations that are growing quickly. And while registered nurses pay well, personal care aides and home health and nursing aides do not pay as well. Personal care aides pay $24,000 a year for full-time year-round work. So those are pretty low wages. We also found that for women, while for both women and men, the risk of automation is higher in low-wage jobs, women face higher risk in their higher and middle-wage jobs. So what we did, we wanted to look at the relationship between low pay and the risk of automation. So we ran a regression looking at this, and what we found is that a 1 percentage point increase in the risk of automation was associated with more than $600 annual decline for men, but just over $300 decline for women. So we see women facing more risk in their higher paying jobs. We also found that automation may be easier to implement in women's occupations. And here, when we think about some of the occupations that women are in, you think about secretaries, bookkeepers, accountants, those are occupations where workers can be replaced by software. You just need software to replace many of the duties. Whereas the occupations for men, if you think about, they would require, in a lot of them, it would require expensive robots to replace men, for example, on construction sites or in factories. There's a lot of concern about truck drivers, but that also is expensive in testing the cars and getting self-driving cars moving. So that means that women also face that inequality there. And all of these points together point to the potential for increased inequality between men and women, but also between different groups of women if we don't have policies that can control and guide the development as we move into the future of work. Here we want to look at a little bit of this broken down by race and ethnicity in addition to gender. And so what we have here is looking at, the one thing that stands out about this immediately is that these are the share of workers by sex, race, and ethnicity in high-risk occupations. So these are those that have a 90% or greater risk of automation. And one thing that stands out is across every racial and ethnic group, women are more concentrated in these occupations than are men. What we can also see is that Hispanic women are the most concentrated in these, so they face the most risk, followed by other race and multiracial women. So that's where we're seeing the most concentration in these high-risk occupations, and those that are least represented in these are white and Asian and Pacific Islander men. And then finally, I want to look at those occupations that have the lowest risk. And again, we see these differences, as Heidi mentioned, across groups because of segregation. But women are not as segregated from one another as men and women are from each other in the labor market. But they do still have different occupational distributions, and that's what creates these differences in risk from automation. And so here, when we look at those at low risk, we can see that Black women and Asian men have the highest representation in low-risk occupations, but they're not in the same occupations. For example, Asian men would be well represented among technology jobs, whereas Black women we see in social work and teachers and occupations like those. So I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of this, and now I want to hand things over to my colleague Ariane, and she'll share a little bit more with you about digital skills and care work.
Thank you, Chandra, for putting a gender lens on the risks in the future of work. I'm going to focus a little bit more on what's already happening in occupations, and particularly the growing need to work with computers and have digital skills, which runs across a lot of occupations. And we're going to draw here on work that's been developed by the Brookings Institute, who set up an index which allows us to rank occupations on a scale from 0 to 100 according to the intensity of computer knowledge and skills. Just to say, before I get into a bit more detail, the three takeaways on this is firstly that women are actually more likely than men to work with digital technologies. Secondly, that digital skill does increase earnings. The more digital skills you have, the higher your earnings for both women and men. But the gap in those returns is pretty big. There's a big wage gap there. And lastly, we know that women are underrepresented in the highest level IT and STEM jobs. But on top of that, the gap is growing. Okay, a little more detail. So this is the mapping of the index of digitalization across occupations. Women are the dark bar and men are the green bar, and you can see women are clustered most strongly in jobs that need quite a lot of digital knowledge and work with computers. And those are jobs like secretaries, like accountants, library assistants, actually doctors, nurses, lawyers. A lot of women's bread and butter jobs are in that field. If you look to this end, now where's my little thing to show things on there? Things, lots of things here. If you look to the left, those are the jobs where you don't need to use a lot of computers here. And women are underrepresented there, which, if you think which the largest occupations are, care work, cleaning work, childcare work, not exactly very well paid, so get out of there if you can. And for men, there's still some good occupations in there, mainly in the construction sector. But talking about earnings, as I said, for both women and men, earnings increase the more you work with digital media or digital content. And in this case, women are the green line at the bottom and men are the red line at the top. And you can see very clearly, earnings are low for hardly any use of technology. And as you move towards the IT and STEM fields at the other end, earnings increase a lot. But the curves are very different for women and men, meaning the more you move into those middle to high IT jobs, the bigger the gender wage gap. And this may be because those are the jobs that may already be attacked, I should be more positive, enriched by technology and where job losses are already happening. It may also be the old story of the undervaluation of women's work. Women work with technology, it counts for less than when men work with technology. And overall, with a linear kind of equation, the gender wage gap in return to digital skills is 41%. So much bigger than the general wage gap on you working between men and women. Okay, now I said earnings are highest in the high-level IT and digitalization jobs. However, women are underrepresented and their underrepresentation is growing. Here are the three largest IT occupations. And in each of these, since 2000, women's share of jobs has fallen. Now, I do think it's important actually to say that there are more women working in those now than they were in 2000 because the workforce is larger, and that also includes more women of color. But men are joining even faster than women, which means that women are becoming even less likely to sit at the table when new technologies are designed and implemented. So this is not just about high earnings, it's also about our future and not to have a gender bias in the way we move into that future. Okay, now to switch a little to care work or aging. We talk about the future of work and automation and technology. Probably as big a change in the coming years is the aging of the population and demographic change. And so what we were trying to do in our report is to get a little sense what technology may do to improve caregiving for family caregivers, for those who receive care, and for people who work in the care workforce. There's a lot of, there's a lot going on. So robots are being developed. There's Pepper there, and to give medicine, to monitor people. There's a lot going on mechanically to make it easier to lift, and for people with physical difficulties to move about. And the other big innovation piece on technology is the digital side, better communication, telemedicine, and the possibility of including domestic care workers, caregivers in houses more into the care team, but hopefully also to make it more possible for them to get some of the benefits institutions save when people age in place, and people prefer to age in place, but often the care workers are left out of those benefits, and we really need to improve those jobs. Okay, so finally, just, you have to say everything 3 times. We probably said it 5 times, just to ram it home. The future is uncertain, and we don't quite know what technology, and we also don't quite agree, so discontent helps clarify the future. But that means policy matters, and policy matters to women because women are differently placed to take advantage or to be hit by changes in the future. So as we said, women are overrepresented in occupations that are most at risk, and that is particularly so for Hispanic women. And the risk is particularly high in those jobs that are stepping stone jobs now into the middle class. Why we need gender, one of the reasons we need gender-aware policy is women do more caregiving work, which means they have less time to do all the reskilling and re-education that they need to do to stay up with the changes in the future. And they also often have less money to pay for it. So that needs investing. And the last point is, there we agree, technology is unlikely to replace the need for care. So care work is going to stay with us and is going to grow. But with the right policies, we can improve the quality of care and hopefully the quality of care work also. Thank you.
Eric, I think now we're next.
Do you want to play our talent stuff? Hello, thank you so much for having me. Great. How's that? Now you can even hear me. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Heidi, for the invitation to be here. Looking forward to discussing this more with Jenny Sperandera from JPMorgan Chase, Head of Workforce Initiatives and Global Philanthropy, and Josephine, and I'm sorry, help me with your last name? Calapenny, Director of Policy and Partnerships at Caring Across Generations. So I wanted to start with Heidi and challenge her on this optimism. I'm hearing, talking about a group of jobs that employs a majority of women. These jobs, 90% chance they'll be automated. The robot apocalypse isn't here. I want to hear about why you are optimistic, despite some of this doom and gloom that I feel surrounds this topic.
Okay. Well, that's a great question. Someone once said that I was the most optimistic person they knew, and I just about died. Because a friend of mine also says that one of the reasons she loves me is I can see the negative in everything. But it's a great question. The main reason is that when you hear these numbers, like 90% of the jobs could be automated, it doesn't mean they're going to be automated. Automating them actually requires someone, usually the employer, to make an investment in technology to allow the job to be automated. And, the recent McKinsey report came out. It's worldwide. It has an estimate for the U.S., which is that the jobs will decrease and the economy will grow, but between the two, there will be a 4% loss in total jobs by 2030. Whereas, as I mentioned, the Bureau of Labor Statistics prediction is 7% growth by 2026 and tightest labor market ever, practically, as Heather told us already. So it's partly because spreading those innovations around the economy takes time. I remember when word processors were introduced into the National Academy of Sciences when I worked there. That was the last earlier report I did on automation. The secretaries were angry that we didn't have enough word processors to put one on everybody's desk. They didn't see any pay raise. They saw that they had to self-teach themselves. And as Ariane said, that's harder for women to do. They earn less. Is that still that 20% wage gap? So basically, dispersion of technology takes time. That's the main reason I think it's going to be slow. And it creates a lot of new opportunities. Just today, we saw an article in the Wall Street Journal about sweaters, which are being sold for $3,000 and $4,000 at places like Bergdorf Goodman, and immigrants from Eastern European nations, formerly Eastern European nations, are earning extra money by knitting when they're on the subway in New York. So these are the new opportunities that our economy is constantly putting out. And you never know what they're going to be, and you don't know where they're going to be. And I mention that one only because my youngest daughter is an art history professor, so. That caught my eye.
Jenny, I want to turn to you. Of course, JPMorgan Chase is a large employer of knowledge, service, and IT workers, and of course, many of those are women. How do the findings of this report resonate with you from an employer perspective?
Thanks, Eric, and Heidi, and everybody for being here and for doing this research, which we were really proud to support. So I think to pick up on Heidi's point, and maybe that first slide, like everybody else, and this is my job to think about this all day long, we were reading so much about the future of work that was so polarized. It was either the robots are coming, they're taking your jobs, panic, run around and panic, or it was, don't worry, nothing's changing, same old, we've been through this before. And I think what was really challenging and discordant for us is that we believe that the answer is probably somewhere in between those two things. And as a business who, as you note, has many different kinds of occupations, particularly here in the United States, we see how technology is changing work here on our own front lines, and we know the answer is much more nuanced than that. So I think for us, there was an opportunity to really think about how do you get more granular with the research so that you can do something about it. I share your optimism, Heidi, because I think, if you're not, it's sort of like we're abdicating the decisions that we can make and that we can support to think about what kind of future we want to see and what kind of future of work that supports workers we may see in all of this. So for us, a real opportunity in terms of working with IWPR was to get one layer deeper and begin to get more fine-tuned on where are those changes? How do we see them manifesting today? We're doing some similar work with MIT right now where we're looking at the financial services industry. And I think what we're going to say is that whole jobs aren't disappearing, but parts of jobs are changing. And some jobs are going to be better jobs, and that's exciting. But not everybody is positioned to take advantage of those benefits. So how do we have to think about our own practices differently? How do you think about something like, I'll just pull an example, tuition reimbursement, right? And think about the way a company like ours or others can think about the policies we already have in place or that we may want to consider and really consider them from the lens of we have people today doing work that's changing, and we want to think about what kind of skilling strategies we need to have in-house to take advantage of those changes.
Just to follow up on that, is there, maybe through this MIT work or through IWPR work, have you identified any technologies that are coming online in the banking industry, and how are those changing jobs? How are you preparing those workers that could be affected?
Yeah, so I'll be careful to speak really from what I know best, and certainly colleagues we have colleagues who are doing incredible work in terms of thinking about the role AI, machine learning, all of that plays in our industry. I'll give an example actually that's more related to customer and demographic changes, which was also acknowledged here. So, and I'll actually use an example outside the firm, but it's relevant to us as well. Last night, I was having travel woes getting down here from New York. I'm sure everybody has experienced that. So after trying to solve the problem myself online, I realized I have to call Delta and get one of their customer service reps. And I think that's a great example of there were a whole series of activities that person would have had to know in the past. But now the reality is many consumers are kind of solving the more routine problems on their own, right? Like I was pushed to digital, I tried to fix it through the app, I tried to go online. So now the kind of problem solving that customer service rep had to do was kind of more multifunctional. They had to tap into other parts of the business, and wearing the workforce hat, they were probably skilled or trained in multiple parts of their business. We've had to think about some of those things for ourselves. When you call a customer service rep for a Chase credit card, they have to be able to respond to a higher level, more sophisticated set of questions. So that does require that we think about the kind of skilling opportunities we're providing.
Thank you. Josephine, the report highlights that the future of work is about technological change, but also about demographic change, particularly an aging population and the growing need for caregiving. So how much of that role do you expect technology to play in meeting the needs, the growing needs of care in this country?
Great question. And thanks, Heidi, for having Caring Across represented here. I'm fascinated by the conversations happening around future of work and technology, particularly as we think about care in both the demographics changes that are happening on the aging side, with 10,000 people turning 65 every day, at the same time that demographic change is happening on the other end with 4 million children being born every year. And so, there are reports about declining birth rates and blah, 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 but the reality is that there's demographic shifts happening on both ends of the spectrum. In all of my work and all the conversations that I have, I always ask a room of people, how many of you want a robot taking care of grandma? Now, that's, very, very few people actually raise their hands. And we actually see technology is a tool and not the answer. And I think when we think about it in that framework, it becomes really critical in thinking about some of the shortcomings that we have throughout our care system. One example that I'm really excited about in thinking about the use of technology in care is we're anticipating a huge shortage in direct care workers. And we haven't found effective ways of recruiting and retaining workers. And what role does technology play in that? And then we're also always mindful about, particularly about who has access to what kinds of technology, both when we're thinking about technology as tools, but also the training necessary in order to advance your careers where technology is concerned. So I often think about gender, race, and the class divide when it comes to access to affordable training and technology, and what does it mean to really revolutionize any industry in consideration of technology. The other thing that we're very mindful of is that care is personal. Family caregiving is personal, caring for an aging or ill loved one, person with disability, caring for a child is personal. And so we identify that, much like what the report actually elevated, is that when it comes to care work, it's sort of a lower risk in regards to turnover. However, if we're seeing turnover in other areas of low-wage work where women are highly impacted and care work continues to be women's work, we can't continue to drive people into work that's low quality and low wage work. So there's a conversation that needs to happen about the impact of technology. Technology is a tool in care, given the changing demographics, and also how we improve current low wage jobs so that they can be quality and family sustaining jobs. The other thing that I always talk about is the fact that the trends are showing that aging Americans are some of the largest consumers of technology, some of the fastest growing populations of Facebook users and digital and social media users. And so we're also thinking about what does that mean then about how technology is both used and developed. I've heard over and over as a policy person myself, I've heard over and over that policy matters. As a policy person, I agree. That keeps me employed, so policy matters. I think the other thing that really matters is who is centered during the design of technology and policy, right? So oftentimes I've seen in conversations with California tech policy, tech designers, where they will develop particular technology or app or something that's intended for the user, and they engage users at the end of a process, only to find that a ton of the usability of particular technology is actually inefficient and ineffective for their target population. So in the fact that policy matters, it also matters who's being centered when we're designing policy, but also who's being centered when we're designing technology and AI. So I think that's another thing that we have to think about when we think about the disparate impact on women. How are then women centered in the actual design of technology and tech advancement?
One of the things I'm always curious about when we look at automation affecting lower wage jobs is that investment truly coming? I can understand a multi-billion-dollar manufacturer looking to replace expensive factory labor with a robot. When you're talking about $10 an hour jobs, do you see that type of change happening in that field?
I'm on the Hill, so I have to think of the politically correct answer. Well, again, I think the opportunity is in looking at technology as a tool and not the answer. I think, I've seen the industry change over the last 20 years from everything from really advanced lifts to help people in and out of bed and chairs, right? And how technology is being used as a tool there. I've seen really advanced incubation chambers for ICU for children, right? But we haven't seen a sharp decline in the actual demand of care workers. So it's actually an industry that seems to be prone to both the negative job replacement impacts of technology, but it's also one of those industries that's been that reacts very differently than other industries where when demand increases, then also wages increase. But the care workforce and industry seems to be completely immune to those kind of industry trends. And so I don't see actually technology coming in and usurping the role of care workers. I do think that there are some flags that we have to think about in regards to if there is displacement in other areas of work and women are driven more and more into care work and it continues to be low wage and low quality jobs, what that means for economic stability, retirement security, people's own aging and health. So I think those are some of the things that we think about. I don't see robots are coming and replacing every home. I do see things like medical monitoring, and I've seen, smart houses that can quickly indicate when someone has fallen, but there's still a need to notify someone who needs to show up and then respond to the situation, right? So I think as long as we think about in those terms, as long as we're mindful that technology is a tool and that we still have to center the fact that these are low wage, low quality jobs that do not sustain family economics, I think that becomes where we really start to think about technology in a different way.
Heidi, when you look at what employers and industries are doing, is there anyone you can point to as a successful model to follow, a place where technology has helped boost wages and productivity as opposed to eliminating jobs?
Well, there are, of course, studies on that, and I'm trying to think whether we've published one of those lately, Jennifer. Don't we have a study on positive examples of education for technological change? Where's Ariane?
No, but I think they're high road studies. I think what's interesting in this is that you can always show, yes, you can just cheapen labor, make it harder, sack people, or you can redesign work and give people a more enrichment. There's studies from retail that we cite in the report, and it was a German company, so I don't know the name anymore. But and a lot of this, I think, I think there's a lot of discussion on high road, but really so much that is the real innovation is still a little more down the road on this. But maybe Jenny also may know.
I was just going to mention that we did interview the head of HR at AT&T, and they talked a lot about their programs, how much they do education on the job, training for new jobs on the job. They, of course, also expect some weekend and night work, and there are many universities now that are offering master's degrees in computer work that you can get for $5,000 a year tuition, and do it pretty much on your own time. So it's one of the situations where it's creating great opportunities for workers if you have any extra time to do that. But store after store I go in wants me as the consumer to do the cashier's job. I don't do it. I always I look for where the people are, and I go into those lanes. Because I do know that there is a labor-saving bias in technological change, and these people might like these good unionized jobs that they have at the supermarkets, and so I support them personally.
The only thing I was going to add to that is the Wall Street Journal is doing a series on sort of business practice. I think, acknowledging the tightening labor market or the tight labor market, and a willingness to think differently. So I think a couple of companies, AT&T, Walmart, JPMorgan Chase was in the mix. And I will say that we kind of speak amongst ourselves. I think these challenges, I'd be curious your take on this, also, or the opportunities look different depending on large companies, more small or mid-sized companies, and then certainly small businesses who have to think about this in a whole different way. And when we think about our philanthropic agenda, we think about, how can we support employer practice change and industry sort of working together to kind of look beyond any one entity's maybe more parochial or narrow interests and really think about what kind of demands do we have that are collective. And then, and this gets into a different topic, and Josephine, I know you're trying to get in, how do we more effectively signal that demand to a whole world of education and job training partners? And so I know we're going to go there soon, and I think one of the important things that's called out in the report in terms of where we go next is this begs a real question around do you have the sort of enabling institutions that can partner with business, that can partner with learners or workers, to really support the kind of mobility or skill building that we want to see? And that's where we put a lot of our energy at JPMorgan Chase in terms of our corporate responsibility agenda on this topic.
I'll just highlight a couple of things that I know about that are interesting uses of technology, particularly in the care space. National Domestic Workers Alliance they're experimenting with a new program called ALIA. I think it's called ALIA. It's a way for employers of domestic workers to pool together to be able to fund benefits and additional pay for direct care workers who aren't full-time employees, aren't getting benefits anywhere, don't have access to paid family and medical leave, but the employer themselves also don't have a surplus of money in order to be able to really support their direct care worker or domestic worker in that way. And so there is this tech platform where users can sort of put into a pool of money on a monthly basis. It's anywhere from $5 on up. And anytime a worker in a particular region needs to pool on that fund for any set of identified reasons, that becomes a way for those workers to access a set of benefits that they otherwise wouldn't have had without this collaborative tech platform that users, employers, and workers can utilize. So that's just one very creative way that's being experimented with. The other thing that I find fascinating is what we call matching registries in this industry. Various states have websites, essentially state-ran websites, which allow it a level of quality, a level of minimum requirements in order to be featured on there that help consumers of care match with a care provider. And not in the way that we think about insurance as finding, a primary care physician, but in really finding a direct care worker. And so you can go on this website, set up your profile, sort of identify the cultural competence things that you want in a worker, the minimum the minimum wage that you're willing to pay, and they will match you up with a set of available workers in your community. And so that becomes, again, an interesting place where when we talk to people who are feeling frustrated with having to navigate the complicated healthcare system and, having complications with agencies and finding a worker, that this becomes one of those few tech platforms that families can go to. It's not in every state. I think there's about 7 nationally. And they haven't been around for very long, I think 5 to 7 years, so there's not a ton of longitudinal data. But it's just an interesting way to think about how technology can be used to advance care and caregiving. And then the other just really practical thing that we often think about is the fact that folks are both trying to work and trying to get trained and trying to advance their careers and trying to take care of family. So then when we think about training requirements for direct care workers and require people to sit in a classroom when they're also trying to work, trying to take care of their families, online training becomes a really accessible place and a really good use of technology for both reaching audiences who need training, but also as a way of doing training in a really accessible way. So Washington State, for example, has one of the nation's best workforce training programs for direct care workers. And one of the things that they were really committed to was funding an online platform to make sure that there were online training platforms for their workers. And so they do online trainings in more than, I think it's something like 87 different languages, and is accessible and is affordable for many different workers. So when we think about that way of using technology in order to support a needed workforce and to really get the care out there that we need, it becomes really critical to think about technology as a tool.
Thank you, and I don't want to leave this without getting a chance to make the ask. We're on Capitol Hill. Let's give the folks here some takeaways. So Jenny, can you tell us, after looking at this report, not everything, what are some of the what are some of the policies that we should be thinking about when we consider this topic?
Okay, so I'm so glad that my colleague Heather Higginbottom was able to join us today, because we are trying to organize ourselves a little bit more effectively around this question of policy. But a couple leap off the page in the executive summary, and I just kind of tipped my hat to them. So our experience as a philanthropic partner in communities around the country and around the world has shown us how critical high quality job training and educational partners are in building the talent pipeline that businesses need and really supporting those workers and learners in their career mobility. I'm afraid that I think when we look for those standout examples, we still see too few rising to the top of the list. When we relaunched our workforce agenda this past year with a $350 million worldwide commitment, we shouted out community colleges in particular. So there's one sort of nugget I will drop here, which is that we see the differentiating value that high quality community colleges that really put themselves in the middle of their community between business, learner, worker, education. I think that this report also shows that there is a value to earning that bachelor's degree or that credential that we should not ignore. That represents a bit of an evolution for us in our own thinking, I think philanthropically, where we really sort of articulated the value of those middle skill jobs, but I think we are saying that automation is changing the number of them, the availability of them, and it's affecting different people differently. So I think as we consider what enables community colleges to really have the resources, the tools they need to be successful, that's one space that I would call out in particular.
I would just add that, the education and training system in the United States is remarkably decentralized. And it just makes it really hard to make sure you're delivering really good training to all the populations who need it, particularly disadvantaged populations who do earn less, who don't have as much money to pay on their own. And what are we doing about that? And we're not doing enough, basically. And so I admire the community colleges. I do think they are an incredible key to this area. I've heard the president of city colleges in Chicago speak recently. Another outstanding one is LaGuardia in New York. There's a great one in California, Florida, this great state of Florida, in Miami, I believe it is. And one of the great things I learned when I was at JPMorgan, we launched this study there. And I think you said, Jenny, that they've gone to maybe Baruch College or one of the public universities in New York City and said something like, we'll take half your graduates if they can do X, Y, and Z. This was a 4-year university. But that's a very effective way, I think, to get, the presentation was about linking these programs at the City University of New York to the financial industry, which is one of New York City's most giant industries. So there's a lot that can be done. I don't know how much time we have left, so I want to pitch an idea I thought of last night. And it's that, we have something called the Trade Assistance Adjustment Act. And if you lose your job because of trade, you can collect an income as a worker. Well, we could have something called the Technological Change Adjustment Assistance Act. So if we do see an interest by members of Congress to work in this area, we don't have an income assistance program like that for workers who lose their jobs due to AI or automation or technology. And I think it's something to consider. It's not an idea we put in the report, but I hope people will start talking about it.
And just building off of what Heidi just said, I think, as we talk about the displacement of workers, the potential displacement of workers, anytime technology is being talked about, it actually means that we have to rethink our social safety nets. Right? So what does that mean about loss of earned income and benefits that you get from a full-time job like healthcare and things like that, affordable childcare? So we have to also be simultaneously reimagining our social safety nets as we're thinking about the role of technology. And then the other thing that I find fascinating is as we think about public policy, and I work particularly in the social safety net world, I still come across state and federal administrators who are using 30-year-old computers who, when they turn on their computers, their screen goes blue first before they even power up systems, right? So if we're moving into a more technologically advanced world, our governments and their ability to administer public programs, their ability to collect data that will inform our continued public policy moves and how their technological infrastructure desperately needs to be updated. I rarely find a public program administrator who is against expanding the program. Their biggest challenge is how to do so and how to add all these additional layers on top of an outdated tech system. And so I often think about those folks that are, in their state houses trying to figure out the new paid family and medical leave law that just passed in their state on 30-year-old technology and systems. So I think that's the other thing. And the last thing I'll just say is that I will always go back to the fact that we have to center the folks who are most impacted by the technology that we're talking about. So if we're designing technology for an aging population, we have to look around the table and see who's involved in that conversation and who's not. If we're talking about the displacement of women, and primarily women of color because of technology, we have to be having active conversations with women and women of color about the impact and what could be different. And also, if we're thinking about the gap that's going to be created in both wages and utility, like who's using technology and who's being displaced, what does that mean about continued job growth and where we're investing in job growth and what that means for folks who are being displaced? The other interesting flag that I'll just say, fascinatingly, in the most recent, in Sanders' recent proposal for Medicare for All, there's actually a line in there about what to do with displaced insurance workers. And I thought that was like a fascinating, aha, someone's actually thinking about what it means to both create infrastructure that could potentially displace workers and is putting a flag about what are we going to do with displaced workers, where technology is happening, where public policy is happening. And I think we have to continue to really ask those questions in a meaningful and thoughtful way, and really talk about solutions. I'm over talking about issues and the problems. I want to have conversations about potential solutions and really move people into the world that we all want to see.
Well, thank you all. I think we need questions. Yeah. Okay. Good. So who has some questions? Perfect. I'll try to repeat. So keep your questions somewhat short, so I can remember to repeat it. Go ahead.
Very good. I really learned a lot. I'm a sociologist. I'm also on the governing board of something called the Labor and Employment Relations Association, our DC chapter. 2 points with regard to aging. We know now that older people want to work more. There have been some studies on this. And then we get into the challenge of technological literacy. Employers want to hire younger people. There's the challenge of learning to learn, and for some people that's not so easy when they don't have the foundation. So that's one set of questions. And the next set is the role of unions. Now, unions may be in a position to take some heed to what Dr. Hartman said about some fund for the technologically displaced. So that's an area we need to look at, and I know there's serious thinking there. And if any sectors are really impacted by automation and robotics, a number of our union employees are. So whoever wants to address these, I will.
Just to recap for the folks watching on the web, we're asking about older workers, their desire to work later into their lives, but perhaps a bias on the part of employers towards younger people, and whether there's ability for older workers to stay with technically literate, and then also the role of unions in this discussion. So, any or all of you?
On a literacy point. So I'm so appreciative that you flagged digital literacy. For us, what we've realized is that a core piece of the work we're doing through the foundation has to be to think about technological or digital literacy as a foundational skill along with literacy and numeracy. So in a number of communities where we're working, we know that one of the barriers to people accessing well-paying jobs is not having those foundational skills. how are we investing in job training models that are really contextualizing literacy to the world of work, because we know that supports adult learners who are able to make much greater gains when they're accessing job training that does that. I will just say quickly that before coming to JPMorgan Chase, I spent most of my career in the nonprofit and government spaces on this topic, and in Philadelphia, where 1 in 3 adults was functionally illiterate. They did not have the literacy skills to fill out a job application. So really thinking about the job training models that help you kind of leapfrog ahead. And I think that's relevant for older workers, absolutely, as you're noting, but also for younger workers who have just not had the kind of educational preparation or access to education that we need to really support them moving into these career tracks, because as IWPR points out, the wage differentials are so significant. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
No, I think that's a great point about both literacy training and on-the-job training. I think we've seen a lot of great work around apprenticeship programs that do direct skills training and on-the-job training and continual education training. As a sociologist, you know, CEUs, continual education trainings, are common everywhere, and I think there's something about incorporating that in any given job, especially as technology changes the nature of an industry and the nature of any kind of work. And then there was one other thing I was going to say. So I will let others comment about unions as well, but I think unions also offer a good model of on-the-job training and ongoing trainings that I think we could learn quite a bit from. I also think that there's just a cultural perception change that needs to happen about what it means to have older workers on any given job site. I think there is sort of like the cultural posture that the older you get, you shouldn't be working, you're frail, you're less able to handle information. And actually some of the studies that we're seeing don't actually support that. If someone is able to work and able to learn, they actually do, and actually thrive in workforces, especially when we think about the nature of isolation and aging. And so what does it mean then to actually create an industry and to create a culture where older workers are welcome in any particular industry? I think that's incredibly important.
I would just say I do see friends here, and you may know that my mom is 101, and she moved here from New Jersey when she was 90, and for 11 years I've been trying to get her to use an iPad or something, and to see all those photos of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I can't do it. So that is depressing. But I will tell you that she's pretty happy knitting.
We have that in common, me and your mom.
And now I've forgotten what I was going to say. Well, I was going to end with the fact that the labor force participation of older people is growing. That means they are working more. And women led that trend. You know, one of the ideals in American life is retire as soon as you can, retire early. And that's what older people were doing. They have healthier lives. They were working less. But all of a sudden, we started noticing, women are working more in their 50s and 60s and even 70s. And like many trends that women lead, men are following. So that is happening. And again, you know, I think of my personal life. I'm really afraid to retire. Some of you may know I'm retiring at the end of August because I'm going to have to listen to my husband yell at his computer. But so we do need a little training in our household on how to speak to your computer at a minimum. And I think these are very important skills. I just hope that with the policy changes that you on Capitol Hill will put in place, we'll be able to have a lot more of this.
I just want to add that there's a great section in the report that's called Mind the Gap. And it really identifies some of the ways technology can actually widen some of the wage gaps and racial and economic gaps that we see, and a mindfulness towards that, especially when we're even thinking about an aging population, becomes really critical. I also just want to say that in that there's there's some real cultural experiences that we have to be mindful of. So there are entire communities that not just distrust government, but distrust technology. And so what does that mean if we revolutionize healthcare, for example, into a completely tech experience for communities that do not trust technology, don't want cameras in their homes, don't want, that fear of police and revolutionized state like that. So I think there's also like a level of cultural competence that we also have to bring to this conversation in thinking about aging and thinking about different cultures and thinking about work. Even the trend for sort of like work at home, what does that mean then for continued work and working later on in life?
And just to not let the union point go, Heidi, you made a reference to like unionized grocery store workers before. Are labor unions part of this discussion, or is it just sort of resist change at all costs?
The Luddites disappeared in the 1800s, actually, and the labor unions are actually leading the charge for using technology in a responsible way. And they have some new reports out on the future of work at the AFL-CIO, the main federation of labor unions in the United States. Unfortunately, labor union representation among workers is quite low. When many people talk about the 1950s as the kind of virtuous cycle when we had everything was positive in the 1950s. I don't quite remember them that way, but one of the things that was positive was we had a much higher representation of workers in labor unions then. It was about 30%, and now in the private sector it's down to something like 7 or 8%. So it's a huge change. And they are experimenting with many, many new ways to organize. Many of us do have experience with organized workplaces. Journalists typically are organized. And it's not, you'd be surprised that many, many workers in unions are white collar. If you are a union worker, you're much more likely to have a smaller gender wage gap, a way smaller racial or ethnic wage gap. I haven't looked at aging in unions, but we do know there is a tendency for a lot of the leadership of unions to be older, but that's also changing. A lot of young people coming into labor unions.
I just realized, I think it was last week I was reading about a Department of Labor initiative around incentivizing what they're calling returnships, which is this idea of folks who either left the workforce for caregiving responsibilities, or folks who did early retirement want to come back to the workforce. And I think there's a conversation that's happening in there also that involves technology and retraining and AI, which I think becomes a really interesting and fascinating place to also see this conversation in there.
Other questions?
My name is Goya. I'm with the president of the Women in Trucking Association. And you talk about truck drivers, and it's actually 8% now. But the use of technology for the trucking industry has increased the participation of women because it's reduced the labor. It's not a physically demanding job like it once was. Plus, women are very concerned about safety, so all the anti-collision, the avoidance, the lane departure warnings, all the technology that's going into the trucking industry is making it a safer environment for women as well, and women make the same amount of money as men in the trucking industry. So we need about 50,000 more drivers. So
Thank you. And your roommate, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Susan Layden. I work for a small policy and evaluation shop called Social Dynamics. And so the issue that I'm particularly working on now is I'm calling it optimal employment, which is kind of a cousin of full employment. So full employment is trying to get people into the workforce and work more hours when they need to. But also, optimal because many people work too many hours. And other people, so the issue is sort of to modulate our working hours. And, I'm thinking about two examples. I just want to throw a few ideas out and let you all react to them from your different perspectives. So one, like in terms of getting women at the top layers of technology companies, for example. One example I think of is I was at a conference and Sharon Sander was moderating, and it was all the ex-Treasury secretaries speaking. And Robert Rubin says, And the topic was, how do you get more women up to the C-suite, up into the top of corporations? And Ruben says, well, you really have to change the expectations of working hours for men and women. Because until you do that, most women, lots of women, are not going to make that choice to work those 70, 80-hour-a-week weeks and sacrifice their health and their family's health. So you really have to change those expectations when you talk about cultural changes. So you need to change the expectations, and how do we, I have some ideas how to do that, how to start this conversation more. But then there's certainly the women and people who need to have more working hours. So I just actually, like, here's an interesting case study very quickly. I just came back from Korea and met with a colleague there. They have new legislation to limit working hours to 52 hours a week. And this is considered drastic in Korea because I think it was 68 hours before or something. So she was doing some evaluation about this new law. And in this one company, he decided, the owner wanted to bring women into industrial manufacturing and see how, because they're less representative in those in some of the manufacturing. So there's a government subsidy, so the women work 30 hours a week, and they're thrilled with it. And when she interviewed them, they wouldn't want to work more than 30 hours a week. So I think, for me, we need to think about how many hours we're working, where paid leave comes into this too, and how to modulate that, how to use, like Heidi's saying, the positive changes. How do we use the fact that we will have technology to help us to do a job with less hours, and how do we use that in a positive way so that we can benefit from the technology changes and use the technology changes? So just some ideas to throw out and let you all respond.
Sure, and I'd just like to hear from the gentleman behind you, and then we'll let our panel discuss these ideas.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question. The tech displacement adjustment act was mentioned in cautious terms. Was there any consideration in the research or your findings on like universal basic income or other methods for addressing the changing workforce outside of more of the traditional programs like loan programs, job retraining, capital access?
All right, so just to summarize kind of the three topics that I took from these questions. One, is there a way for technology to help optimize the amount of hours that women work? Is technology, like in trucking perhaps, opening up access to women to get into different fields than they have been before? And then are there policies like universal basic income or other similar things that might help address some of these? So, and any of those you'd like to take, go ahead.
Heidi?
The report does not discuss universal basic income, but I'm sure that we could do a report on that, and there are reports. I mean, obviously, we're all worried about the increasing inequality of income and wealth in the United States. It's very, very high, and it is, many would say not optimal. And basic income is getting a lot of play recently as a way to transfer income to people who need income, which we have many. So there's a whole association that you might want to join to look into it. I guess it's called BIG.
Oh, this isn't for me personally.
No, I meant as public policy. We don't address it in the report as public policy, but it's an advocacy group that's pushing the ideas of the basic income grant. That's all.
Eric, on that last point you noted, or that was in there around how can we use technology to think about how we organize work? One of the examples that kind of jumped out at me in the report was like a paper and pencil example, right, about the retail organization or company that realized if we just put a calendar up on the wall and allowed people to select their ideal work schedules, we had more than enough coverage. So I think this actually picks up on one of Josephine's point, which is like, where can employees lead or workers really help lead a conversation? What could potentially surface from that? We have a big body of work internally around bureaucracy busting, and I think really relying on the frontline staff who know the ins and outs of where there are challenges and headaches. And it's not always the most sexy topic, but I think it's really gratifying to see those changes take shape and that they can result in real, sort of bottom line benefit and real positive experience. The only other thing I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out, and Heidi knows this, that at the company we do have an internal group called Women on the Move, which is in particular focused on supporting women employees in terms of their career mobility, in terms of thinking about the emphasis of the firm, the work that we do in, day out as a financial services company. And some of the topics that group has helped highlight and give visibility to is work around reentry, which at the firm is about oftentimes people who have left for care and are coming back to the workforce, and also job sharing arrangements where there are roles that can be, again, organized differently so that responsibilities are shared across employees. And I think they're really innovative models. I hope that we can sort of lift them up for other companies to look at and learn from what others are doing that we'd be smart to borrow from. But those are a few things that I think we're really proud of as a firm. We have a tremendous number of women in the C-suite. So it's I think, I don't think it's coincidental. We have a female CIO, in fact. I think that leadership really has probably heightened awareness to the kind of particular realities women face and in the financial services industry, no less.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comment about increased engagement of women in the trucking industry because of technology and what that's meant for safety and engagement and things like that. Because I definitely think that there's an arena of both industries, but also work to really think about in those terms. So I often go back to the Lyft. Both my mom and my sister are nurses, and they talk about how revolutionizing for care Lyfts have been for them and for home care and for things like that. So I'm constantly thinking about that, so I really appreciate your comment for that. And similarly, when I think about hours and flex hours in the direct care industry is just so problematic, with some workers needing to have 4 different clients in order to make a sufficient wage, and what that means about transportation and the hours in between, and then other workers being in such high demand because of the region that they're in, that actually there's more hours than there are workers. And so what role does technology play in that? I mean, I think if we can figure out how to do food delivery to a family through a church, through an app where everybody's fills their name into a slot and drops off a dish at a family who need, we can figure out this sort of flex hours and role that technology can play in workforce and in industries and in really increasing industries. So fascinating idea. And then to your comment about UBI, I think ideas like universal basic income, paid family and medical leave, again, shoring up the social safety nets becomes an even more critical conversation for us to be having in light of technology, in light of AI, and in just what we have to talk about in regards to shoring up our social safety nets as displacement happens all across industries. What does that mean for the additional supports that families and individuals are going to need? Affordable, if technology is making it more likely for women to enter into a workforce, but women are the primary caregivers for their children, what does that mean we have to do on the affordable childcare side of things, right? So all of these social safety net conversations can't be separate from a technology and a tech advancement conversation, because one solution sort of creates another conundrum and challenge. And so we have to keep having those conversations where UBI is alive and is a good conversation, where paid family and medical leave has to become the reality of the world that we're living in if we're talking about increased and longer engagements in the workforce. So I think all of those things just become ongoing conversations and necessary when we're thinking about policy interventions.
What about over on this side of the room? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andrea Rodriguez with the Association of Public Land Grant Universities. First, thank you. This was great. The report, the presentation was amazing. I'm primarily interested and curious because I think Heidi and Jenny and Josephine talked on it a little bit about sort of leveraging institutions, especially acknowledging that many institutions are facing sort of this decline and deficit of the traditional learner and moving into more of the adult learner because of this apocalypse of robots coming and getting us or something. But looking at that and acknowledging that, and the adult learners re-entering because there is a need to rescale and upscale, how would you leverage and use this report sort of to develop strategic partnerships with institutions, especially in the urban setting, since that's where we're seeing a lot of sort of these challenges that students are facing?
All right, see you guys nodding. So go ahead.
I just have a quick organizing answer. What we have often found works in the world of public policy is to really have proof points that live somewhere. The reality is, like, you can have a policy proposal, you can have all the great data behind it, but folks want to know, where is this happening? Where are good models for this? And so that's, to me, where really good public and private partnerships become critical in really testing out some of this stuff, whether it's within a large employer. What does it look like to have a really intensive on-job training that's really focused on new tech usage, but for a particular audience, older adults that are re-entering the workforce, or whatever that population is? The more proof points we have at state and private sectors, the more likely we are then to really see momentum in the public policy space. So that's sort of my organizing plug about, like, who are the large employers that we can sort of plant experiments in, and to really see what the efficacy of some of the solutions that we think could work are before raising them up into public policy standards.
So I agree completely with that. You know, like, I'm just a pragmatist. Like, does it work on the ground? You know, I think our take is that these are big macro level challenges. They will only be addressed through partnership and collaboration between public, private, social sectors. And I think we do have some examples of where we think that's working well. I'll call out one, and it's local. The Greater Washington Partnership has organized an agenda here locally around a couple of key issue areas, including human capital, recognizing that DC has had this influx of tech jobs, and this predated maybe that one in particular announcement that attracted a lot of attention. But there were a lot of companies spanning different industries that all needed cybersecurity talent, AI talent, and at varying levels, not just PhD computer scientists, but entry-level folks who are scrubbing data and jobs that are more accessible even for folks without a bachelor's degree. And this comes to the idea of better signaling demand. So these companies got together and said, we're going to try to speak with one voice around the kind of knowledge, skills, abilities we're looking for. And we're going to sit down across the table from a bunch of higher education partners, and we're going to start articulating what this is. And so this effort called Capital CoLab really sprung up, where business and higher ed is coming together to figure out, sort of in between those two spaces, how do we build better talent pipelines? The first point of thought was around students in the bachelor's degree, kind of like the traditional learner. But we've recognized, hey, this is something we need to leverage for people younger. So how do we get school districts in the region to participate? Because while how they use the information may look different, it's the same information, you know, the same knowledge, skills, and abilities, but you have to rationalize it so that you're teaching it in the right way. And then I think the flip side of that, which, you know, maybe down the line, is the opportunity to think about where do they fit in on that kind of reskilling and upskilling opportunity. To your point about the report, you know, I think the report underscores something that people probably say in a general way, but really puts numbers against it, which is there is a diversity and inclusion opportunity here, but you have to seize it and you have to be intentional about it, because if you kind of approach it as a business as usual, you may end up with the same kind of results playing out. So how are you being really thoughtful and intentional about who is receiving outreach for an opportunity like this, which students are being recruited into these credentialing programs, because it becomes a real opportunity. But if the equity issues kind of bear out in the way that we've seen in the past, what a missed opportunity. So, I mean, I know I'm going to flip this report to everybody and underscore it and say, like, hey, we supported this, we're supporting you. What do you think? So that we can hopefully bring that example back to this group, you know, in a year's time and say, here's what we saw.
Well, I just want to congratulate you for being with the Association of Land-Grant Colleges. It's a very important organization, and it reflects a very important investment that the U.S. Congress made in land-grant universities all across the country. The one thing that I have noticed in the research trends is doing more research on work schedules, not exactly about matching employers with educational needs, but I think it was the Gap that had that experience with the experiment when they could give their own, choose their own work schedules. It worked very well, and they increased sales at older stores, which was considered a huge achievement, by 10%. That is huge, actually. Retail does not include increased sales at older stores by 10% a year, and they did. So it was everybody like, whoa. So I think work scheduling is a really, important part. One of our major projects at IWPR is the Student Parent Success Initiative, or SPICI, and we have a lot of partnerships, informal partnerships with a lot of community colleges and others, and people are going to these schools part-time usually, often in the evening. Childcare is a challenge. This research program is to find out more about their needs and what works. And many schools are investing in that now, many of the colleges and universities, but all of them on average, there's always outliers, they are getting much less investment from their tax dollars. The state budgets and the city budgets generally, not everywhere, but generally have been cut, and they are receiving much less public grants to support their education. So scheduling of education and work hours are both very important, and there is some new research on that. I also remembered what our new report is. We do have one on women's role in innovation. We have one on patenting and one on exemplary programs in increasing the amount of innovation that women do. So we do have that kind of example case study report out there. So that's another a huge research area right now, too, is entrepreneurship and innovation, and many colleges are supporting that.
Maybe time for one more quick question. Any more questions? Here you go.
So I'm from Women in Government. Thank you for speaking today. So I liked how you guys in the report used a racial lens and a gender lens, and I was just wondering more on an ability lens level. So how do you see this automation technology impacting women workers who are differently abled, and do you see opportunities to be, for certain job areas to become more accessible than they might have been before? Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, please speak to that. Any closing remarks?
Heidi, do you want to start, given the authorship?
Or I feel like you the floor.
Well, I think we did hear a very good example from trucking. I think you'll see another one in construction. We see much more use of simple things like lifts at even the construction of one-story developments around the country. We're used to seeing them in big cities, but rural areas also can benefit from these kinds of new technologies in a very, simple area, construction. Obviously, computer work, computer systems design, it does reward people with high IQ. High IQ has almost nothing to do with people who are differently abled, physically. So it is a great field right now for people who have that particular ability to innovate in that particular area, and that does include many differently abled adults and children. We have, it is an important share of our workforce, and it is one that's overlooked. And I think there's also an awful lot of experimentation with new forms of using online education for people who are differently abled. And I think we'll just continue to see a huge amount of research in that area, too.
I'll just say thank you for the question. It kind of begs to me that we call it out a little bit more than we have, so I appreciate you highlighting it. It's also an area where I think in our grants portfolio, we've been thinner, in all honesty, and we'd love to continue to figure out how we lift up examples that are particularly noteworthy.
That's it. What they said.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor to have you here. Thank you.